The air within the radio observatory was a cold, constant hum, a symphony of unseen circuits and distant signals. It was a sound I had come to internalize, a low thrumming beneath the skin that spoke of purpose and isolation. Here, amidst the monolithic dishes that turned their blind faces to the heavens, I found my only true communion. My world was not the green and blue sphere beneath my feet, but the fathomless dark beyond it, a canvas of ancient light and whispered gravity. My fingers danced across the console, a familiar ballet of key presses and trackball glides. For years, I, Dean Thorne, had charted the cosmic currents, mapping the skeletal remains of galaxies and the birth pangs of nebulae. The universe, in its vast, indifferent majesty, was my life's singular obsession. I sought pattern in the chaos, order in the infinite sprawl. Today, like countless days before, began with the methodical sifting of raw data streams. My task was to filter the noise, to discern the faint signal of a quasar's dying breath from the static of a distant storm. It was a meticulous, solitary endeavor, one that demanded a singular focus, a mind unburdened by the trivialities of proximity. Then it appeared. A flicker, a momentary aberration on the primary spectroscopic readout. My gaze, honed by years of scrutinizing such screens, snagged on it. It was too brief, too faint to be anything significant, likely a transient instrumental artifact, a cosmic ray kissing a sensor, or perhaps a faint, uncatalogued stellar flare. I made a mental note to check the calibration logs later, dismissing it with the practiced ease of a seasoned observer. The cosmos was a messy place. Anomalies were merely data points awaiting explanation. I continued my work, calibrating a new set of filters for a deeper scan of the Andromeda galactic halo. The faint, persistent hum of the observatory was a lullaby, lulling me into the rhythm of my intellectual pursuit. But as the next sweep of data populated the screen, the aberration returned. This time, it held. It was an absence that shifted, a lacuna in the fabric of the celestial map that seemed to defy the very pixels that rendered it. My brow furrowed, a slow knot of curiosity tightening in my gut. I brought up the anomaly's coordinates, isolating the patch of sky for a more intensive scan. This was no mere blip. The secondary monitor, usually displaying the familiar, predictable geometries of deep space objects, now showed something else. A region of space, vast and silent, where the expected light signatures simply ceased. Not an extinction nebula, which would scatter and absorb light, but a sharp, clean cut. And within that cut, where nothing should have been, there was an implied geometry that my mind struggled to reconcile. The space seemed to fold in on itself, not like a black hole's extreme curvature, but as if the dimensions themselves had been subtly restitched. My initial dismissal gave way to a surge of pure, unadulterated scientific fascination. This was a puzzle, a magnificent, infuriating puzzle. I leaned closer, my breath misting the cool glass of the monitor. I initiated a series of multi-spectrum analyses, pushing the observatory's capabilities to their limits. Radio waves, infrared, X-ray. I bombarded the anomaly with every observational tool at my disposal. Each new set of data returned the same impossible picture, confirming its presence, deepening its enigma. It was a region of space that simply should not be. A non-Euclidean wound in the cosmic tapestry. I felt a prickle of intellectual pride, a possessive thrill. This was my discovery. The Thorne anomaly. As I immersed myself deeper, hours bleeding into an indistinguishable stream, I began to notice things. Subtle shifts in the ambient sound of the observatory. It was too indistinct to be a voice, too formless to be an echo. Perhaps the ventilation system, I mused, or the settling of the massive dish outside. My mind, ever the rationalist, sought immediate, mundane explanations. It was gone before I could properly register it, leaving behind only the ghost of a distortion. My eyes snapped to the spot, but everything was as it should be. Sterile, metallic, unwavering. Fatigue, I decided. Long hours in the spectral glow of screens could play tricks on the sharpest mind. It was merely the thrill of discovery, the adrenaline of facing the unknown. But the anomaly, my anomaly, continued to stare back from the screen, an unblinking eye of impossible geometry. But that comfort had begun to fray, unraveling with each new packet of data that pulsed across my main display. My fingers, usually so precise, hovered over the illuminated keys, a slight tremor betraying the growing disquiet in my chest. The screen before me glowed with the raw, untamed signature of the anomaly I'd stumbled upon. It wasn't merely a point of light or a spectral smear. It was a complex lattice of energy, a network of intersecting lines and planes that refused to conform to any established model. I zoomed in, then out, manipulated the filters, and adjusted the spectral bands. Each permutation only solidified the perplexing truth. The patterns were impossible. They were geometries that twisted upon themselves, angles that summed to more or less than 180 degrees within what should have been a flat plane. Lines appeared to curve inwards and outwards simultaneously, creating an optical illusion that my mind struggled to reconcile. My internal monologue, usually a calm, analytical stream, began to stutter. Equipment malfunction, I told myself, the words a desperate anchor in a sea of incongruity. A stray cosmic ray, perhaps, an unknown interference pattern. I had seen my fair share of data glitches in 2 decades of staring into the void. Every sensor, every receiver, every processing unit reported optimal function. No anomalies in the observatory systems. Nothing. The region of space was supposed to be empty, a barren expanse between distant galaxy clusters. Yet here it was, a vivid, undeniable presence in the data stream, a silent, persistent broadcast of defiance. The initial spike had been dismissed as a transient event, a statistical blip. But I had a stubborn streak, a deep-seated refusal to leave any cosmic stone unturned. I had retasked the primary dish, dedicating its immense aperture to that precise vector. For 3 consecutive nights, it had stared, unblinking, into that vacant patch of sky. And for 3 consecutive nights, the impossible geometries had pulsed back, a silent, taunting rhythm. It was the stubborn persistence that began to gnaw at me. This wasn't a fleeting error. It was a constant, stable signal. The lines on my screen, once merely data points, began to feel like a tangible entity. A silent observer returning my gaze. I found myself tracing their impossible intersections with my finger on the screen, feeling a phantom resistance against the glass. It wasn't the fear of the unknown, but the fear of the unknowable. I worked through the sunrise, the eastern windows of the radio observatory bleeding pale light into the control room. My eyelids felt weighted, my vision blurring at the edges. When I finally pushed away from the console, the fluorescent hum of the room seemed louder, more insistent, a buzzing behind my eyes. The drive home was a blur of highway and the growing realization that the world outside the observatory felt thinner, less substantial. The familiar lines of the road, the geometric precision of the power poles, all seemed subtly off, as if the rules governing their existence had been bent ever so slightly. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fractured tapestry of restless images. I woke repeatedly, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, convinced I had heard a faint, high-pitched whine, like the distant cry of something immense and unseen. Occupied by something that defied my understanding, something that had started to whisper to me through the impossible angles of its existence. But the answers I was finding were beginning to unravel the very fabric of my world, starting with the quietude of this place. My focus, for weeks now, had narrowed to a single, impossible data stream. The anomaly, once a distant statistical blip, had become a consuming obsession, its tendrils reaching, it seemed, even into the hallowed silence of my console. Amidst the predictable crackle and hiss of the deep space receivers, a new timbre began to emerge. I'd attributed it to a faulty capacitor, a loose connection, the mundane decay of aging equipment. But it persisted, growing in complexity, weaving itself into the background noise. It wasn't a melody, not in any human sense, but a sequence of tones that defied harmonic principles. Discordant, yet strangely coherent, like a language spoken by something that perceived sound not as vibration, but as an interplay of impossible angles. It would swell, then recede, a silent internal music composed of frequencies that grated against the very structure of my inner ear, leaving a phantom ache behind. I would pause, my hand hovering over the controls, straining to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to emanate from the data itself, from the very notion of the anomaly. Then came the shapes. They were never direct, always at the periphery, just beyond the focal point of my vision. A flicker in the shadow cast by the towering server racks, a momentary distortion in the polished gleam of the floor. They were not solid objects, but absences, impossibilities rendered visible. A polygon with too many sides, or perhaps too few, its edges bending inward, not outward. I would whip my head around, my breath catching, only to find the familiar, unwavering lines of the radio observatory. The fluorescent lights hummed with their usual dull drone. The equipment stood solid and inert. Nothing. Yet the phantom image lingered, a stain on my inner eye. My isolation deepened. Calls from a colleague, a gentle knock on the heavy door went unanswered. Just a breakthrough, I'd mumble to the empty room, justifying my hermitage as profound dedication, when in truth it was fear. Fear of the ridicule that would greet my observations. Fear of the pity in their eyes. They would see a man crumbling, not a man seeing too much. The most disorienting manifestations began subtly, then with an unnerving confidence. The dimensions of the radio observatory itself started to warp. I would walk across the main control room, the distance to the far wall suddenly seeming to stretch, the floor tiles elongating beneath my steps, then snapping back to their true proportions with a silent, sickening lurch. The ceiling, a familiar expanse of acoustic panels, would appear to dome inward, pressing down, then recede into an impossible height, the overhead lights shrinking to pinpricks. My hand, reaching for a switch on the console, would sometimes feel as though it traveled through a viscous medium, the air itself thickening around it, only to find normal resistance a moment later. It was not a tremor in the building, nor a trick of the light, but a fundamental shift in the very space around me. The solid, unwavering architecture of the radio observatory, a bastion of human precision, was becoming fluid, an extension of the anomaly's alien influence. I would grip the edge of my console, knuckles white, my gaze darting around the room, trying to re-anchor myself in the known. The coffee mug on my desk, a mundane ceramic cylinder, would momentarily appear to twist, its rim becoming a bizarre helix before settling back into its ordinary form. My sleep, when it came, was shallow and haunted, filled with echoes of the discordant music and the flicker of impossible geometries. I existed in a state of perpetual hyper-awareness, my senses on high alert, waiting for the next subtle assault. Each distortion, each impossible perception, served only to reinforce my conviction. The anomaly was not merely a distant object of study. It was a presence, vast and indifferent, and it was reaching for me, not with tendrils of light or energy, but with the subtle, insidious warping of my very reality. I was no longer an observer. I was becoming entangled, a single, insignificant thread in its impossibly vast tapestry. And the tension within me tightened, a taut string pulled to its breaking point. The anomaly, a gaping wound in the fabric of the sky, had become my sole obsession. Its impossible geometry, a non-Euclidean knot tied in the very light of distant stars, beckoned with a terrifying allure. I sat before the main console, fingers dancing across the illuminated keys, a ghost of a tremor running through my hands. Days had bled into nights, the sterile glow of the screens my only constant companion. My eyes, gritty and red-rimmed, devoured the spectral data flowing in from the dishes. I had designed new algorithms, intricate mathematical nets meant to ensnare the anomaly's elusive form, to pin down its shifting edges. Tonight, I was running a high-resolution scan, hoping to penetrate its opaque heart. The main display, usually a crisp, orderly grid of astronomical data, began to ripple. At first, I dismissed it as a software glitch, a stray cosmic ray interfering with the processing. I typed a command to recalibrate the visualizer, but the distortion persisted. The faint, swirling outline of the anomaly on the screen seemed to breathe, its impossible angles expanding and contracting with a subtle, unnerving rhythm. It wasn't a void, I realized with a sudden, chilling certainty, not merely an absence of light. It was a presence. A low, resonant thrum began to emanate from the speakers beside me, a sound that wasn't part of the observatory's usual mechanical symphony. It was deep, almost infrasonic, vibrating through the floor and up into my bones. My instruments, usually so precise, started to waver. The delicate needles of the flux monitors quivered erratically, then spiked, registering energy signatures that defied explanation. They weren't coherent, not like a stellar flare or a pulsator, but a chaotic, almost intentional surge. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a static object. This wasn't a passive phenomenon. The anomaly was not merely there. It was responding. It was a vast, living structure, its impossible architecture not fixed but in constant, deliberate flux. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stripping away the last vestiges of my scientific detachment. It wasn't just observing the universe. The universe was observing me. I slammed my fist on the desk, the dull thud lost in the growing thrum. "No," I muttered, my voice hoarse. "Impossible." My rigorous training screamed against the notion, but the data, raw and undeniable, was screaming louder. I initiated a series of high-frequency pings, hoping to map its internal structure, to force a clearer image. Each pulse, a focused burst of radio energy, should have bounced back with a distinct echo, painting a precise picture of its geometry. Instead, the returns were garbled, fragmented, as if absorbed or actively deflected. Lines bent in ways no light should, angles twisted into Escher-like paradoxes, and colors shifted through a spectrum unknown to human eyes. It was like staring into a mirror that reflected not my face, but 1,000 impossible versions of it, each one more unsettling than the last. My hands trembled as I tried to stabilize the data feed, to filter out the noise, to make sense of the madness unfolding before me. My scientific rigor, once my shield against the unknown, now felt like a fragile barrier against an encroaching tide. I was an astrophysicist, trained to understand the universe through mathematics and observation, not to grapple with entities that actively defied both. This wasn't a star, a galaxy, or a black hole. This was something else. Something ancient and vast, and terrifyingly aware. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Was I losing my mind? Or was this the anomaly, reaching out, touching me with its alien consciousness? I forced myself to breathe, to focus. My vision began to swim at the edges, the sterile white walls of the observatory subtly warping, their straight lines curving into gentle, unsettling arcs. I knew, with a horrifying certainty that transcended logic, that the anomaly was not merely distorting my instruments. It was distorting me. It was a profound, active presence, and it was playing with my perception, with my sanity, as effortlessly as a child might shatter a delicate glass figurine. The impossible anomaly, a vast non-Euclidean structure, had torn that illusion to shreds. The anomaly consumed my thoughts, a relentless parasite burrowing into the very architecture of my perception. I had started with the conventional, the peer-reviewed, poring over every astronomical catalog, every theoretical paper on exotic matter or gravitational lensing. Nothing. The void of information was as terrifying as the anomaly itself, a gaping chasm where answers should have been. My fingers, trembling slightly, drifted from the familiar astrophysics databases to the more obscure corners of the digital world. I began with ancient history archives, searching for any mention of celestial oddities, impossible structures in the night sky, or sudden inexplicable shifts in human behavior attributed to cosmic phenomena. The hum of the observatory seemed to deepen, a resonant frequency that vibrated against my teeth. The initial results were sparse, fragmented, often dismissed as superstition or the ramblings of the deranged. Yet, a pattern, faint as a phantom limb, began to emerge. There were references in archaic texts to skyborne geometries that devoured reason, celestial architects of madness, and the great eye that saw without light. One particular illuminated manuscript. I pushed deeper, my search parameters growing increasingly desperate, bordering on the esoteric. I delved into historical accounts of mass hysteria, unexplained disappearances, sudden outbreaks of what was then called melancholia or divine madness. I found chronicles of forgotten civilizations whose final architectural marvels were colossal, impossible structures that defied all known engineering, their angles and curves echoing the alien logic of the anomaly. The air in the observatory felt suddenly heavy, thick with the ghosts of these forgotten observers. My vision flickered, the straight lines of my monitor screen seeming to waver, to bend subtly, like reflections in disturbed water. Cryptic online forums, hidden behind layers of encryption and pseudonyms, became my next haunt. Here, amongst the ramblings and paranoid delusions, I found it. The undeniable, horrifying echo of my own experience. Then came the specific, sickening details. Accounts of individuals who, after prolonged exposure to these anomalies, often glimpsed through telescopes or in strange, almost accidental ways, began to mutilate themselves, carving geometric patterns into their skin, convinced they were revealing a deeper truth. Others, driven by an irresistible compulsion, created art that was not art, but rather an attempt to render the unrenderable. These were not paintings of landscapes or portraits, but intricate, self-referential structures built from discarded materials, from hair and teeth and dried blood, all adhering to the same impossible non-Euclidean logic. One user posted a blurry image of a sculpture, fashioned from countless bird bones, twisted into a Mobius strip that seemed to writhe with an unsettling life of its own. I wasn't alone. The realization was a double-edged blade. On one hand, a desperate validation. I wasn't simply losing my mind in isolation. This was real. And it was a contagion of the mind, an insidious, reality-warping presence that had claimed others before me, driving them to acts of grotesque self-expression. The images of those bone sculptures, the descriptions of carved flesh, burned behind my eyelids. I was observing the anomaly, yes, but I was also being observed. And the boundaries of my perception, once so solid, were dissolving like sugar in a cup of infinite tea. I was not safe. I was merely next. My vision flickered, the straight lines of my monitor screen wavering as if seen through heat haze, then snapping back to crisp definition. The whisper, that sound like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty plain, lingered at the edges of my hearing, a phantom echo within the cavernous silence of the radio observatory. Just fatigue, Dean. Too many late nights. I pushed away from the workstation, needing to stretch, to break the spell of the persistent hum that vibrated through the floorboards. As I stood, a ripple seemed to pass through the very air, a distortion not of light, but of space itself. The long corridor leading to the main dish control room, usually a stark perspective of concrete and metal, appeared to briefly curve inward, its distant end pinching to an impossible point before straightening with a shudder. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. The corridor was normal again, stretching out in predictable geometry. A mug of lukewarm coffee sat on my desk, a forgotten sentinel. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against its familiar ceramic. Yet, as my gaze drifted for a fraction of a second to the oscillating sine waves on my primary display, then back to the mug, its handle had rotated. Not a full 90 degrees, not even 45, but just enough to be wrong. It had faced left. Now it faced right. A trivial shift, easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness, yet a prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. I picked it up, turned the handle back to its original position, and set it down with deliberate care. I stared at it. It remained. But the shadows. They pooled in corners like spilled ink that absorbed light rather than merely obscuring it. The familiar shadow cast by the rack of servers, usually a crisp rectangular block, now possessed an unsettling fuzziness at its edges, a soft, indistinct bleed that seemed to breathe. I watched it, my breath catching in my throat, convinced it was subtly expanding, encroaching further onto the polished concrete floor. I needed to clear my head. My reflection stared back at me, superimposed over the distant celestial fire. My own face, weary and etched with the strain of sleepless nights. But then, as I focused on it, a faint, almost imperceptible undulation passed across the glass. My reflection's eyes seemed to drift apart, then snap back together. Its mouth, for a fleeting instant, stretched wider than was natural, a silent rictus grin that wasn't mine. The anomaly, the impossible structure I had painstakingly mapped, was not merely an object out there. It was seeping in, dissolving the boundaries of my perceived reality. The radio observatory, my sanctuary of logic and observation, was becoming a liminal space, a threshold where the rules bent and broke. I pressed my palms against the cool glass, trying to ground myself. It was beautiful in a terrible way, a sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly within my skull, vibrating against the delicate membranes of my sanity. This isn't real. I turned from the window, my gaze sweeping across the control room. The server racks, once orderly pillars of technology, now seemed to lean inward, their metallic surfaces shimmering with an oily sheen that wasn't light. The air tasted of ozone and forgotten echoes. A stack of printouts on a nearby desk, moments ago a neat pile, had somehow rearranged itself into a spiral, the papers fanning out like petals of a mechanical flower. I walked towards it, my steps heavy, my mind wrestling with what my eyes presented. I reached out a trembling hand, tracing the impossible curve of the paper. It felt solid, real, yet its configuration defied any natural force. My internal logic, the very foundation of my scientific mind, was crumbling. Each anomaly, each subtle shift, was a chisel against the edifice of my understanding. Was I truly seeing this? Or was my mind fabricating these distortions in a desperate attempt to cope with the incomprehensible? I had sought to understand the universe, to map its furthest reaches, and in doing so, I had stumbled upon something that sought to unmap me. I found myself back at my desk, staring at the monitor displaying the latest data from the anomaly. The geometric patterns, once merely abstract representations, now pulsed with a faint internal light. I thought I saw a new line, a new vector, emerge from the data, not drawn by code, but as if it had simply appeared. The veil was thinning, and I was no longer an observer. I was becoming part of the experiment. An oily sheen, not of light, but of something else entirely, coated the metallic surfaces, making them writhe under my gaze. The air in the radio observatory's control room tasted of copper and a silence that hummed, a silence far louder than any noise. My fingers, still tingling from the phantom echoes of the last observation, tightened on the edge of the console. It wasn't enough. The distant whispers, the visual distortions, the gnawing dread, they were mere echoes. I needed to stand at the precipice to feel the raw, unmediated presence of whatever lay beyond the veil. A frantic clarity had settled over me, a conviction that only direct communion could bridge the chasm between my reality and its incomprehensible existence. I had to expose myself. My hands, steady despite the tremor in my chest, moved with a practiced, almost ritualistic precision across the control panel. I bypassed the standard filters, the safety protocols designed to protect against solar flares and cosmic noise. My goal was not to filter, but to open, to invite. I rerouted the primary dish's raw feed, a torrent of unprocessed cosmic radiation, directly to the central processing unit, and from there, through a custom-built amplifier I'd installed days ago, straight to the console's primary audio and visual outputs. A single dedicated terminal, glowing ominously, would be my window. The hum of the machinery deepened, a low thrum that vibrated through the floor and up into my bones. I leaned forward, my face inches from the screen, my ears poised. The air grew heavy, thick with anticipation, or perhaps with a gathering presence. With a final, deliberate press of a key, I initiated the direct feed. A sound ripped through the control room, not through the speakers, but through the very air itself. It was a chord struck on instruments that could not exist, a cacophony of frequencies that simultaneously pierced and compressed my eardrums. My vision blurred, the terminal screen blossoming into a kaleidoscope of impossible geometries. Lines that should have been straight bent and folded. Colors bled into each other, creating hues I had no name for, tones that tasted like ash and burning metal. It was not a picture I saw, but a feeling projected directly into my mind. A crushing, infinite weight descended, not physical, but existential. My thoughts fractured, scattering like glass shards under an unimaginable force. I was not looking at an anomaly. I was being looked through. It stretched beyond the concept of vast, dwarfing galaxies into mere motes of dust, entire universes into fleeting sparks. Its scale was so utterly, horrifyingly immense that my mind buckled, struggling to grasp even a sliver of its true nature. It was an ocean, and I, a single molecule of spray, caught in an indifferent current. There was no malice in its gaze, no conscious cruelty. Humanity, our struggles, our triumphs, our very existence. We were less than an afterthought, less than the microscopic detritus clinging to the surface of a cosmic leviathan. We simply were not in its awareness. Our universe was a fleeting ripple on its surface, a momentary disturbance it would never register. My life, my work, my frantic search for understanding it was all a futile dance on a speck of dust, watched by no one, cared for by nothing. The universe was not a grand stage for our drama. It was an accidental, indifferent byproduct of something so vast, so ancient, that our entire history was but a single, unobserved flicker. My body convulsed, my muscles seizing as if trying to tear free from the mental pressure. The impossible geometries pulsed, each beat a fresh assault on my sanity, each wave of sound a deeper plunge into the heart of cosmic despair. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the raw feed cut. I collapsed, my body hitting the cold metal floor with a dull thud, gasping for air that tasted thin and metallic. My vision swam, the control room now seeming to twist and contort in a perpetual state of flux. I lay there, shivering, my mind a shattered mosaic of the truth. I had achieved my communion. I had found my understanding. And it was far, far worse than any nightmare I could have ever conceived. The entity was not a monster to be fought, but a reality to be endured, a truth that rendered all struggle meaningless. The oily sheen on the server rack bled into the very walls, the chrome dissolving into something akin to wet, polished bone. I felt myself falling, though my feet remained rooted to the grimy industrial carpet. It was a descent into a chasm of pure information, a torrential downpour of raw, unmediated existence. My mind, a delicate instrument honed for order and logic, was suddenly plunged into an ocean of chaos. There were no stars here, no light, only the crushing weight of an indifferent, vast presence. A fundamental, ancient truth woven into the fabric of everything, yet utterly alien to consciousness. Sounds twisted into shapes. The low hum of the servers became a chorus of unheard frequencies, a song sung by something infinitely old, infinitely patient. It was the sound of bedrock grinding, of galaxies spiraling into nothingness, of time itself unraveling. My ears ached, not from volume, but from the sheer unlikeness of it all. This was the universe stripped bare, and humanity, my entire species, was less than a speck of dust in its indifferent eye. We were a fleeting thought, a momentary flicker that would extinguish without notice, without consequence. A cold, vast understanding unfurled within me, not as words or images, but as an undeniable, chilling certainty. The anomaly wasn't a thing to be observed. It was observation. It watched, not with eyes, but with an omnipresent awareness that permeated everything. And in its watching, it subtly reshaped. Not the grand, dramatic shifts of fantasy, but the slow, insidious erosion of what I believed to be real. My own thoughts felt like borrowed echoes, my memories like fragile glass, each shatter point revealing another impossible vista. The world was a sieve, and I, the water, was leaking. Panic should have seized me, but even that felt distant, a quaint human emotion from a life I could barely recall. There was only the communion, the terrible intimacy of being utterly consumed by something that did not care, did not hate, did not even acknowledge my existence as distinct from its own. My identity, my very sense of self, began to fray at the edges, unraveling into the vast cosmic tapestry. When I next became aware, the control room was still. The oily sheen had receded, leaving behind only the sterile gleam of chrome, the dull gray of the console. Yet, everything felt different. The air was heavier, charged with a lingering static, and the shadows clung with a deeper, more profound darkness. My body felt alien, a cumbersome vessel I inhabited but did not fully control. My limbs moved stiffly, as if relearning forgotten mechanics. I stumbled towards the water cooler, my reflection in the polished steel a stranger. My eyes were wider, perhaps, and held a vacant intensity I hadn't seen before. My mind was a fractured landscape. Names, dates, equations that had once defined my life now drifted like smoke, just beyond the grasp of recall. What was my name? Dean. Yes, Dean Thorne. A sudden, overwhelming urge compelled me. I walked to the central server, the one housing the anomaly's data stream, and placed my palm flat against its humming casing. It was a ritual, I realized, even as I performed it. A subtle, almost imperceptible tremor passed through the metal into my hand and settled deep within my chest. I stood there for a long time, unmoving, feeling the faint thrum, a silent heartbeat resonating with something immense and ancient. It wasn't about mapping the cosmos, it was about being mapped. We were the lines on a diagram, the fleeting patterns in a grand, indifferent equation. The entity didn't interact. It merely existed, and its existence was enough to reshape reality, to rewrite the very laws of physics through sheer, vast presence. Humanity was a game played on a board it didn't even know existed, with rules it could never comprehend. A player that saw no difference between a star and a single neuron, both merely components in a cosmic tapestry. And we were not alone. We were merely unheard, unnoticed, unremarked upon. I was no longer Dean, the astrophysicist. My vision blurred, not from fatigue, but from the very light itself seeming to fracture, each pixel on the monitor a tiny winking void. The hum of the machinery, once a comforting drone, now pulsed with a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor and into my teeth. A frequency I felt more than heard, speaking of geometries not meant for the ear. I knew. I had known since the first impossible scan, since the anomaly had whispered its non-Euclidean truth into my instruments. But now, the knowing was a burning brand, searing itself onto my consciousness. It wasn't just out there anymore, not just a stain on the cosmic canvas. It was here, within these walls, within me, and it was reaching. A terrible tendril, invisible and indifferent, stretching its influence like an unseen tide. My fingers, strangely numb, fumbled across the keyboard, pulling up the global astronomical feeds. My determination, a fragile shield against the encroaching madness, urged me to seek confirmation, a shared nightmare. Then, a headline. A stark, simple sentence from a South American observatory's public feed. Unprecedented stellar aberrations reported in Crux constellation. My breath caught, a jagged thing in my throat. Crux, not far from the anomaly's projected vector. I clicked, the mouse feeling like a dead weight. The report detailed stars appearing to drift from their established positions, their light exhibiting an unnatural recursive quality. A colleague, a seasoned observer from the Atacama, had appended a note, his usual scientific detachment replaced by a terse, almost frantic query about possible unknown atmospheric lensing phenomena. Or something else entirely. Something else entirely. I knew the something else. It was the same impossible geometry that had begun to resculpt my world. The static in my headset crackled, then a voice, strained and laced with a peculiar tremor, filtered through. "Dean, are you there? It's the lead technician from the Northern Sky facility. We're seeing irregularities, not just light pollution. Something is happening with the auroras. They're forming patterns, Dean. Patterns that... tessellations." The technician stammered, his voice thin, almost breaking. "Impossible symmetries. And the colors, they're not just green and purple. There's a shade, a sort of deep, bruised plum that shouldn't exist in the natural spectrum. And the sound, Dean. We're picking up a low-frequency hum, pulsing from the ionosphere. It's resonant, like a heartbeat. A heartbeat. It wasn't just astronomical, it was atmospheric, terrestrial. The anomaly wasn't a distant object to be observed. It was a predator, or perhaps a gardener, subtly reshaping the cosmic soil. And I, with my relentless pursuit, my insatiable curiosity, had been the first seed it found. I had opened the door, not just for myself, but for everything else. I was the vector, the unwitting herald of its creeping influence. I tried to speak, to warn the technician, to articulate the horror pressing down on me, but the words caught in my throat, transformed into a choked gasp. How could I explain that the sky itself was being rewritten, that the very concept of natural law was a quaint, forgotten fable? A sudden, sharp pain lanced through my temples, as if my skull were being gently pried apart. The monitors flashed, displaying not data, but swirling, impossible fractals, their lines twisting into shapes that defied Euclidean geometry. I stood, my knees shaking, my gaze fixed on the main screen, where a news channel was now broadcasting live. A reporter, pale and visibly unnerved, stood before a crowd of people in a city park. They were pointing, not at anything discernible, but at empty air, their gestures tracing intricate, invisible patterns. The reporter spoke of mass public fascination with an unidentified atmospheric phenomenon. But his voice trembled, betraying a deeper unease. He mentioned shared visions and a collective sense of altered perception. Mass delusion, or shared truth. I saw it then, projected onto their upturned faces, reflected in their vacant stares. The anomaly wasn't just influencing perception. It was becoming perception. It was not merely observed. It was interwoven, a thread in the collective consciousness, a silent, pervasive hum beneath the surface of the world. The radio observatory, once my sanctuary of scientific inquiry, was now a nexus, humming with the terrifying symphony of a universe unraveling. And I could do nothing but listen. The hum of the server racks in the radio observatory was a familiar lullaby, once a comfort, now a low, persistent thrum against the bone behind my ears. It vibrated through the floor plates, up my worn boots, settling in the marrow. Each blink felt like a shutter closing on a different reality, only to reopen on a slightly skewed version of the last. The faces of the others, a blur of worried frowns and hushed whispers, had receded, leaving me in a pocket of distorted silence. I stood before the main console, fingers hovering over controls I had configured myself, each button a memory, each screen a testament to my life's singular pursuit. The data streams still flowed, a river of impossible information. My eyes, weary and bloodshot, traced the familiar contours of the anomaly's signature, the non-Euclidean angles that defied visual logic, the frequencies that sang of impossible distances. I had charted its growth meticulously with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. A sharp, metallic tang filled my mouth, the taste of ozone and old fear. I remembered the oily sheen on the server racks, the impossible geometries dancing behind my eyes, and then the ripple across their skin, the shared vacant stares of a crowd I could no longer recall. Was it a dream? A fragment of a waking nightmare? Or a memory too sharp to be anything but true? My gaze drifted to the vast parabolic dish outside, visible through the reinforced glass panels of the control room. It pointed skyward, a silent, gaping maw, always listening, always receiving. But what if it wasn't just receiving? What if, all this time, it had been a conduit, a mirror? My fingers twitched, brushing against the smooth, cool plastic of a joystick. But it lingered, a ghost image on the periphery of my vision. Dean? A voice, soft and hesitant, broke through the cacophony in my skull. It was a colleague, his face etched with concern, his hand reaching out, then pulling back. "Are you all right? You've been staring at that screen for hours." I didn't answer. My focus narrowed, drawing in the details of the screen. The anomaly, a vast, swirling entity of pure abstraction, had always been out there. That was the core of my life's work. To observe, to record, to understand the universe from a safe, detached distance. But the geometries I had documented, the impossible angles I had meticulously mapped, now seemed to twist and reform, not just on the screen, but through it. My breath hitched. But what if they weren't random? What if they were responses? What if they were echoes, reverberating from an unseen source shaped by my own inquiries? I had been so proud of my discovery, of my unique ability to perceive and interpret the anomaly. My genius, my obsession, my very isolation had been the perfect crucible. I had poured my entire being into this work, believing myself to be the grand cartographer of the unknown. But I wasn't the cartographer. I was the map. The anomaly hadn't just been observed. It had been observing. It had found me, a mind capable of grasping its impossible forms, a consciousness receptive to its silent broadcasts. My research wasn't a journey of discovery. It was a carefully orchestrated unfolding, a deliberate manipulation. Each breakthrough, each flash of insight, each moment of profound understanding wasn't mine. It was given. It was broadcasting me. My theories, my calculations, my very thoughts were being fed into something vast and indifferent. I wasn't studying the anomaly. It was studying me, using my intellect as a lens, my life as an instrument. My life's work, The grand edifice of my cosmic understanding was nothing more than a toy, a plaything for an entity beyond comprehension. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. The metallic taste in my mouth intensified, bitter and sickening. The unseen audience had been there all along, not out in the cosmos, but behind my very eyes, weaving its impossible patterns into the fabric of my perception, turning my greatest strength into my ultimate undoing. The hum of the servers no longer sounded like a lullaby, but a drone, a monotonous celebratory chant of my own profound, horrifying irrelevance. The cold metal of the console felt alien beneath my fingertips, a distant thrumming vibration that resonated not with the machinery, but with the hollow space behind my eyes. I sat, or perhaps merely existed, in the main control room of the radio observatory, the vast parabolic dishes outside silently drinking in the universe's whispers. But what they transmitted now was not data. It was a hymn of dissolution. My eyes, dry and aching, were fixed on the central monitor, not truly seeing the familiar star charts or the usual cosmic dust. What lay there, shimmering in the periphery of my vision, was a fractal impossibility, a geometry that defied the very notion of space. It was the anomaly, of course. It had always been there, a distant, silent observer. Now it was closer. Not physically, not in any measurable sense, but in the way a shadow lengthens until it consumes the object casting it. A colleague, a younger researcher whose name now evaded me like a forgotten dream, cleared his throat beside my workstation. "Dean, are you all right?" His voice was a thin, reedy sound, like a string pulled too tight. I didn't answer, but the geometries I now perceived, bleeding from the screen into the very air of the radio observatory, were no longer observational. They were participatory. The lines of the console desk seemed to waver, softening into curves that shouldn't exist, then snapping back with a sickening lurch, like a dream you almost remember. The colleague shifted his weight, his presence a dull pressure at the edge of my awareness. "The readings are fluctuating again. We're getting some strange interference." He gestured vaguely towards a smaller monitor near mine, but his eyes kept flicking back to me, a flicker of unease in their depths. I saw what he meant. The oscilloscope display, usually a predictable cascade of green waves, now showed jagged, impossible spikes, brief, violent tremors that stretched beyond the screen's physical limits. But I also saw the subtle distortion around his own head, a faint, iridescent ripple in the air that made his features seem to swim, like a face viewed through heat haze. He didn't seem to notice it, or perhaps he dismissed it as tired eyes. I knew better. It was the entity's breath, its silent exhalation touching the world. Interference? My voice was a rasp, a sound I barely recognized as my own. It's not interference. It's recognition. He frowned, a deeper crease forming between his brows. Recognition? Dean, you haven't slept in days. You look unwell. Maybe you should step away, get some air. Air. The thought was a foreign concept. What was air but another medium for the entity to permeate? I finally turned my head, slowly, the movement of vast effort, to look at the colleague. His face, usually a canvas of youthful ambition, was now tinged with something akin to fear. Not fear of me, not entirely, but of something he couldn't name, something in the air between us. As my gaze met his, I saw a momentary flicker in his eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible widening, as if he'd just glimpsed a sliver of the impossible geometries that now defined my world. He blinked, shook his head, and the moment passed, leaving only a lingering discomfort in its wake. It's always known. He backed away a step, his hand unconsciously reaching for the edge of his own console, as if for an anchor. Known what, Dean? What are you talking about? What was I talking about? The truth. The truth that the universe was not merely vast and indifferent, but actively consuming. Not with teeth or claws, but with an endless gaze, a silent, pervasive presence that reshaped reality from the inside out. I felt a strange lightness, a detachment that was both terrifying and liberating. My own mind, once a fortress of logic and reason, was now merely a conduit, a window through which the entity could observe its latest acquisition. I pointed a trembling finger at the main monitor, where the non-Euclidean anomaly pulsed with a silent, terrible beauty. "Look." The colleague hesitantly leaned closer, his eyes scanning the screen. "It's still the same image, Dean. Just the anomaly, the structure." But it wasn't the same. Not to me. The edges of the screen were no longer straight, but curved inwards, creating a tunnel-like effect that drew my vision deeper, past the surface, into the swirling depths of the impossible geometry. The lines on the floor, the seams of the wall panels, all seemed to converge on that central point, a silent, inescapable vortex. The radio observatory, once a sanctuary of scientific pursuit, had become a vast, intricate diagram of its presence. He saw nothing but the data. Yet, as he stared, I watched a subtle shift occur in his posture, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a minute tremor in his hand. He was feeling it, I realized. He didn't understand, couldn't articulate it, but the entity was there, making itself known through the edges of his perception too. I smiled, a slow, vacant stretching of my lips that felt alien on my face. It wasn't a smile of joy or even of madness, but of a profound, terrible understanding. I was no longer Dean Thorne, the astrophysicist. I was merely a vessel, emptied of self, filled with the boundless, incomprehensible expanse of it. The universe had claimed its plaything. The colleague mumbled something about needing to check the primary receiver array, his voice laced with a desperate urgency to escape my presence. He hurried away, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the metal floor, as if trying to outrun an invisible pursuer. I turned back to the screen, to the endless gaze of the anomaly. It was no longer just an image. It was the world. It was me. The radio observatory, with its silent dishes turned to the heavens, continued its vigil, gathering signals, processing data. But the data was different now. A hum that was slowly, inexorably beginning to spread. And I, Dean Thorne, was simply a part of its silent, indifferent expansion.